Well, good evening. It's five after the hour, and I think we are going to begin. Welcome to the second session of our eighth annual Touro University, California Social Justice and Public Health Speaker Series, hosted by the Public Health Program. My name is Gail Cummings, and I'm the Program Director for the Public Health Program here at TUC, and I'm joined by Dr. Deirdre Wilson, Co-Coordinator of the Social Justice Public Health course and Co-Moderator for today's session. The topic of this year's series is Economic and Political Inequality, a Threat to Public Health, which is a follow-up from our last year's series, which focused on public health and well-being in the time of COVID-19 and racial injustice. This year's series examines those issues more broadly with a more upstream approach and analysis that will explore the intersections and influences of our nation's policies, politics, and economics as critical determinants of health. So to help us understand and untangle these upstream root causes, implications, opportunities, and solutions of these critical determinants, we have a five-part series with leading experts in the field of public health and social justice from across the country and state, as well as from right here in our communities in Solano County. We are really excited and thrilled today to host today's session with a panel conversation with three local activists from right here in Solano County, who will talk about reparations and the land back movement as public health issues and discussed really from more of a public health framework. But before we begin, I want to turn it over to Dr. Deirdre Wilson, Chair of the Community Action for Health Concentration, who has some housekeeping issues that we want to make sure you have before we begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the 8th Annual Social Justice and Public Health Lecture Series. For our students and those of you who are interested in continuing education, please look at the following information on the slides, and I will also post the information in the chat. Just as a reminder, this is a webinar, and the Zoom is also being recorded. So if you have any questions about that, you can send it to the panelist. This is a required course, and all students who are taking these courses should sign in with the unique webinar login. The webinar login is used to track your attendance. If you have any questions, please send me an email via Canvas. Today's presentation is an overview of the reparations as a strategy to solve health inequities. And we have three wonderful speakers. As a reminder, the question and answer session will be held at the end of the three speakers that will present today. If you would like to ask a question, please submit your questions in the Q&A chat box. For those of you who are interested in continuing medical education units, I will provide the following activity code in the chat. You can sign in using the eads.com or the EADS app. For those of you who are interested in our Social Justice Lecture Series digital badge, I will also provide a link to the enrollment for this badge. This is a first-time unique badge that we're offering for each of the lecture series from 2018 through 2021 for 2022 for those of you who are not students. If you have any questions about the badge series and how it can be used, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Cummings so that she can introduce our speakers for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. To start off, we'll begin with a discussion about the land back movement, and we'll hear from Kim DeOcampo from the California Tribal TANF Partnership. We'll provide a land acknowledgement and brief overview of the overall issues faced by local indigenous communities and help us to understand the land back movement and how these efforts impact the health of these communities. Following Kim, we will hear from her colleague, Corinna Gould, from the Socorro Trust, who will speak about these efforts here in Solano County. I'd like to provide a brief introduction to Ms. DeOcampo. Kim DeOcampo is from the Tuolumne Miwok, Homa Choctaw African American and is of African American descent. Kim grew up here in Vallejo and has worked extensively in the Native community for over 35 years. She is the director of Sacred Sites Protection and Rights of Indigenous Tribes, and she is also a board member of the Sorority Land Trust, an indigenous woman-led land trust here in the Bay Area that addresses food justice, land-back movements, and climate change. Kim is also a member of the Diversity and Equity Committee with the Solano County Behavioral Health, as well as with the Solano County Diabetes Coalition. She's worked to remove dehumanizing Indian mascots and imagery in our public schools and professional sports. Her work also extends to issues related to historical trauma and addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women. Kim has worked to bring about the first Native American and historical trauma event to Solano County, and she works to address trauma in Black and Brown family members who were killed in Vallejo by state-sponsored violence. Kim works for the California Tribal TANF Partnership as a caseworker in Fairfield and provides social services to underserved Native community residents in Solano County. And I'd just like to also add to Kim's bio, it wasn't there, that Kim was a recipient of the Public Health Program's 2022 Community Hero Award, acknowledging her for her work to support these issues of health equity right here in Solano County. She also sits on the board of the Public Health Community Advisory Board and has been really a true champion for our program over the last several years. We are very privileged to have Kim be a part of our program, and we appreciate her being here today. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, you kind of said a lot of the stuff that I was going to say, and so let me just start off by saying Kuchikalu, which is good evening in my Tuolumne Miwok language, and welcome Turo staff, students, and community members. I am Kim DeOcampo, and I am from the Tuolumne Miwok tribe, as well as Homa Choctaw and African American from Southern Louisiana. And I have lived in the city of Vallejo for 63 years. I am a caseworker for the California Tribal TANF Partnership in Fairfield. TANF stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. So this is the only social service agency in Solano County that serves low-income Native American families. So I want to start off by acknowledging that we are on the occupied ancestral lands of the Karkina Ohlone, the Bay Miwok, the Northern Yokuts, and Patwin peoples who lovingly stewarded these lands since time memorial. And despite ongoing colonization and theft, we continue to exist through our own resilience, our own self-determination. That is why, for me, land-back reparations are so important. It is not a claim to owning the land, but belonging to the land. I am a board member of the Sorority Land Trust, and I am deeply honored to be a part of this urban Indigenous women-led organization. For many of you who don't know, this organization got its start right here in the city of Vallejo during the 2011 Glen Cove waterfront land occupation, in which natives and non-native allies came together to protect this sacred site. So, land back for me is a way to reclaim my wellness, to reconnect to ancestral foods and ancestral ways. I live with type 2 diabetes, and our Native people have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the United States. And much of this is because of the theft of lands that provided us with an abundance of food. Colonization is related to the health issues that we face today. And as urban natives, so much of our lands have been overdeveloped and industrialized. So part of the work that is being done is to steward land that has been returned back to us, or lands that we've had to purchase ourselves. These lands are healing spaces, to grow food and medicines, and also provide a place for us to hold ceremony. And both Corinna and I are both, born and raised in urban areas. So these things are very important to us. And sadly here in Solano County, our Native community continues to be erased when it comes to addressing healthcare, social justice, and environmental issues. So also, for me, land back reparations also means for me as a way to reclaim ancestral names of landscapes, like our mountains, our rivers, our lakes. Many of these places were replaced with the names of colonizers, further erasing us and keeping the trauma of dispossession always present. And that also goes the same for my work in removing Indian mascots, because all of these things do is just continue to stereotype and dehumanize our people. And so let me just end this by saying that reparations is an ongoing process, as is the process of decolonization. As urban natives, we too are scrambling to find affordable housing, earn a living wage, having our children go to schools that are underfunded. There is an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And all of this leads to stressors that greatly impact our health. So in closing, land back is putting the stewardship back into Indigenous hands, decolonizing our diets, connecting to culture. I don't see us eliminating health disparities until we all actively dismantle white supremacy and the institutions it has created that continue to erase, discriminate, and oppress our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim, for those educational nuggets that many of us have not been aware of, particularly when it comes to urban Indigenous communities. And I think it's so important, the work that you have been doing, and we so appreciate the partnership that you have and the collaboration that you've had with Truro Public Health Program and Truro University as a whole. You have held us accountable to ensure that we as a community don't participate in this culture of racism. And so, again, we really do continue to appreciate working with you. And just so you all know, Kim has also been really a critical person in helping us build the social justice series. And we so do appreciate her making these connections with the folks like who I'm about to introduce is Miss Corinna Gould. So thank you, Kim. So Corinna Gould is chair and spokeswoman for the Confederated Villages of Lejeune. She was born and raised in Oakland, California, and is a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 4. Corinna is co-founder and lead organizer for Indian People Organizing for Change, a small Native-run organization that works on Indigenous people's issues. Excuse me. Which was sponsored by the Shell Mound Peace Walks from 2005 to 2009. These walks brought about awareness of the desecration of sacred sites in the Greater Bay Area. As a tribal leader, she has continued to fight for the protection of the shell mounds upon the nation's inherent right to sovereignty, and stand in solidarity with her Indigenous relatives to protect our sacred waters, mountains, and lands all over the world. Her work has led to the creation of the Segurite Land Trust, a woman-led organization within the urban setting of her ancestral territory here in the Bay Area. This organization works to return Indigenous land to Indigenous people, based on an understanding that Oakland is home to many peoples that have been oppressed and marginalized. Segurite works to create a thriving community that lives in relation to the land. Through the practices of rematriation, cultural revitalization, and land restoration, the Land Trust calls on Native and non-Native peoples to heal and transform legacies of colonization, genocide, and to do the work of our ancestors and what future generations are calling us to do. So please help me welcome Corinna Gould.
Thank you so much, Gail. Thank you, Kim, so much for that opening also. I just spoke to you in my native language, Chochenyo. And Chochenyo was the first language in the East Bay. And my great-grandfather, Jose Guzman, was one of the last speakers of the language. and in a place that we live in. I just want to welcome all of my relatives out there from all over the place. I saw when you were signing in that people here from all over the country, and it's really blessed to have you be in this space that Zoom has allowed us to do that. Even in this time of crisis, when we are still dealing with a pandemic, even though people are pretending like we're not still dealing with it, that we are able to be in this space together across timelines and across state lines and across all of these other things that are happening. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Segurite Land Trust, but I also wanted to talk about how this is affecting, how the land trust has changed lives and continues to change lives because of having a land base now. My people are not federally recognized, and most people go through their school not knowing what the difference is between Native people, thinking that all Native people are the same, and that we all get a lot of benefits from the government. But even though there are hundreds of California Native people, hundreds of different tribes, not all of us are federally recognized. Federal recognition allows for tribal people in those tribes that are federally recognized to have access to infrastructure within their tribal land base that allows them to have schooling and to have medical care. Even though, if you can believe it, that there are reservations that still don't have running water. In Navajo Nation, there are people that still have to go to wells many miles from their own home to fill up buckets of to get clean water to their homes. Many places don't have electricity on reservations. And we're sitting here in 2022, and you would think that you would be walking onto a third world country. There are places and there are reservations that are hundreds of miles away from a hospital. And so although federally recognized tribes are supposed to have access to these very minor things that we think and take for granted today, it's not that way. And I live in an urban area, as Kim said. We grew up in an urban area, and actually the urban area grew up around us. This is our tribal territory. In the last 200 years, if you're from California, anything that was built has only been built here in California in the last 200 years. California was colonized in a much different way, in a different kind of a brutality than other places in the country. And so just a little bit about my history. I am the tribal chair for the Confederated Villages of the Shaw Nation. We encompass 5 Bay Area counties. Our tribal people come from a confederation of tribes that were enslaved at Mission Dolores in San Francisco and Mission San Jose in Fremont. We don't talk about slavery in California. Native people were enslaved at the missions for 99 years. And if you think about the history that we're taught, you think about the history of the Declaration of Independence being written and signed in 1776. And in 1776 was the same year that the mission was created in San Francisco. Much different kind of colonization. We were enslaved at the missions for 99 years, where our lands and our traditional ways and our language was taken from us. And many of our ancestors died of starvation, of being whipped and worked to death, and from new diseases coming in. Then there was a period of the Mexican Rancho period in California, when Mexico won its independence from Spain. And at that time, huge swaths of land were given to soldiers that fought in that war. And my ancestors went quite literally from being slaves at the missions to being enslaved at the ranchos. And then there was a war that was created, held between Mexico and America. And that is how America won the land of California and Arizona, Mexico. And it was the Treaty of Guadalupe de Hidalgo that was signed that allowed these states to be created. And instead of creating treaties with California Native people, there was laws that were created which made it illegal to be Indian in the state. And there was actual bounties put on California Native people's heads, $5 a head, 25 cents a year. And so it was legal to hunt our ancestors. And so I tell you this story because this really has to do with our health, right? It has to do with the genocide, the continuous genocide that continue to happen over and over again, running for your life. Many Native people were able to figure out ways in order to survive. I am thankful that my ancestors figured out a way in order to survive so that we could tell our stories now. It was only about 20 to 25 years ago, as we were doing the work with Indian people organizing for change and spirit, that we began to really tell these stories in a way that people could hear it and understand that we were not disappeared. It was the federal government's and the state government of California's role to actually exterminate us, to make us go, and so that we wouldn't be able to tell our stories. But the other way that they exterminated us was by not allowing us to be federally recognized. And so they disappeared us in another way. The other way that we're taught to disappear is through school. And we are taught about in fourth grade history in California. And then in fifth grade, you learn about the gold rush, but you don't learn about the hunting of us. And so we're not talked about in history anymore. And so we're disappeared again. We're invisibilized in many different ways, and we become this background of people thinking of this romanticized idea of Native people living on the plains somewhere, riding horses, and having powwows every day or something. But that's actually not it. Native people across the board have the highest poverty rate in the country. We were the first, we were put on reservations. Those that were federally recognized were put on reservations where you could not grow food on, that there were no access to clean water. Then, so over years and years of living like this without any kind of opportunities to go to school or have jobs that were there. And some reservations in South Dakota, the unemployment rate is at 78%. You imagine if one of our cities would have 78% unemployment rate, what that would look like. The devastation of people's psyche, the bringing the depression that comes with it, the drugs and alcohol that comes into our communities that are brought into our communities on purpose to get our people away from the land. And we really believe that it's some policies that are created in order to get Native people off the land. You would never know that in the Bay Area and some of the biggest cities in the country, Chicago, New York, LA, have some of the largest populations of Native people here. But you can't see them. They've been invisibilized. They become small populations that you can't see. And the reason why they're in these cities was the forced relocation laws that were passed by the federal government in order to get rid of us. Native people are the only one that have to prove who they say they are in this country. If you come into this country and you say you're Italian, nobody questions it. If you're Irish, nobody questions it. If you're African American, if you're a Filipino, nobody questions that. American Indians are the only people in this country that have to prove who they say they are, the first people of this land. And then they created a blood quantum system that allows for the disappearance of people, a continuous genocide of our people. If you are born a half-blood person, that means your one parent was full-blood Indian and another parent was non-Indian, that makes you only half Indian. If you marry another person that is not Native or Native from another tribe, and you have children, your children are only a quarter Native. By the next generation, they disappear. This was a policy that was created to disappear us, to continue the genocide of our people. We're the only ones that have to follow this law. And so it's really devastating when you begin to think about it, when you begin to say, who am I? If I'm not Native, if I grew up in my community, if I know my songs and my languages, if I know my traditions, but according to the federal government, I'm only 1/16 Native. What does that make us? You disappear as a people, and this is on purpose. And of course, it creates a lot of stress inside of our bodies. And so that's why we have the highest rates of type 2 diabetes and cancer and high blood pressure and heart disease in our communities. New York Times came out today, and they published an article that said that Native people have actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to look at it right now. Looking at the COVID tolls, that we have actually lost the life expectancy by 7 years in the last 2 years. That Native people's life expectancy went from 71.8 years down to 66.2 years in the last 2 years. That means that we lose our elders and that our people do not become elders, that we begin to lose generations. And why is this? I mean, they believe that COVID has something to do with this. Why is that? We were affected most horrifically by COVID on our reservations and in our communities, that it ran rampant in there for a long time and that we lost lots of people. And so it dropped the rate. And that's because we have these health issues that were brought in by other countries, by policies of the United States government to disappear us. I'm going to share my screen and only talk a little bit about this because I wasn't actually prepared to talk about a lot of the things I just talked about, but I thought it was important to start there. The Sogorea Land Trust is the first urban indigenous women-led land trust, and sometimes people get a hold of my bio, and for some reason it doesn't say indigenous, it just says urban women. It's an urban indigenous women-led land trust, and why is that important? It's important because we have a high population of Native people that live within the city boundaries, and that many of our people that were brought here on forced relocation policies during the 1950s and 60s have not been able to go home to their own tribal places. When we say home, we mean to the place that your ancestors first came from, not the apartment or house that you live in. When are you going home? When are you going to go to your people again, to your land, to your waters? It was important for us to create this place because Indigenous women, Indigenous people didn't have places to go to. We have one place in Oakland called the Intertribal Friendship House, which is the oldest urban Indigenous community center in the country. It was started because of those forced relocation policies, but we don't have land. Not only do Indigenous people that are intertribal not have land, but the first people of this land don't have land. We became homeless in our own homelands. We had no place that we could go where we could, without outside interference, to pray, to have ceremonies, to gather our foods, to do any of those things. And a few years ago, this group called Planting Justice in Oakland went to Standing Rock in 2016, and they were moved by what was happening there. Thousands of people from all over the world came to stop an oil pipeline from going under the river. Thousands of people from all over the world, thousands of Indigenous people. These young people that run Planting Justice went there, and they were moved by what was happening. And they asked the elders at that time what they should do. And they said, you should work with the First Nation peoples on whose land you live on. And they agreed to that, and they thought about it. And they have this 2.5 acre plot of land in deep East Oakland, a place that many people would understand that nobody's coming to save. They had this 1/4 acre of land right here. And they invited us to sit under this California walnut tree one summer day and said that they told us that story and said that they wanted to give us back this 1/4 acre of land that they had not used yet. Planting Justice is not just an organic nursery, but it also works with and employs formerly incarcerated men and women coming from San Quentin, and also employs migrant families that live in the neighborhood. This is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Oakland, and it's a 1/2 mile walk from my own home. We thought that we talked to them and said we would take this land back on a couple of conditions, that we would build relationships with these men and women who have been incarcerated that take care of these lands, that we would clean up this space, and that we would build relationships again. This is the first piece of land returned to us in 250 years. Imagine not being in touch with your own homelands, living here, but having no space to be who you really are. It created a lot of harm in our communities. But this place is a place of resiliency. This place is also a place that we are named after. Our native tribe is named after the waterways that we come from. We're the Lashawn people, and this is our waterway. It didn't look like this a couple of hundred years ago. This place back here is a freeway, the 880 freeway, and this freeway sits on top of one of our burial sites, and it also sits on top of marshland. It's on fill. So my ancestors already created village sites where fresh water met salt water and marshlands. And so this quite literally could be a village site that my ancestors had lived for thousands and thousands of years. You could not see this if we had not told this story, but you could begin to see what it would be like again, to clean up this waterway so that fish can come up inside of it again, to recreate these micro ecosystems where we could get fresh water and we could have good breathing, and that we could have trees that grow again and bring back plants. And that's what we started to do. We started to work this land to bring back traditional plant life, traditional ways of life, and to engage people from all walks of life in order to do this work. People came from all walks of life to come and help us to celebrate this time that this land came back to us. Because it didn't mean just that it would just serve Lashonaloni people or indigenous people, but it was a way for us to engage people from all walks of life. Because as human beings, we all need to engage ourselves in working in the land. As urban people, we forget that we are supposed to be, as human beings, engaged with the working of the land, touching the land, growing things, being a part of it. We forget. But during COVID, we actually remembered. There were times during COVID where you couldn't buy seeds because so many people were engaging in food production, growing gardens again, trying to get, and people tell us in medical places, they say that human beings going outside and being in the land actually helps you. It helps you physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Native people knew this and continue to know this and try to bring people back into the land. This is Janella LaRose, our co-founder and co-director of the Saborte Land Trust. When we got this land, we decided that the first thing we were going to put up was an arbor. An arbor is two concentric circles that is our prayer center. It is a place that we have not had in 250 years, a place where we can pray freely. There are mosques and synagogues and temples and churches and any kind of religion you want in our territory, but there's not a place where we could go and have our own ceremonies and dances. So we decided to put this together, but we didn't know how to do it. It had been 250 years, and so we had to remember and pray. And so 10 of us went up and got the logs that we needed in order to do that. We cut down the redwood logs, and it's taken all of us to carry this one portion of a log because they were about 700 pounds when we moved them. We moved these logs down to Oakland and thought we were going to put this structure up in about a month. And those logs kicked our butt for about a year. We continue to move them on the land, have people from all walks of life that put their hands on them, that began to take down the bark of them and to sand them and to put their prayers in them, and saving people from themselves in a lot of different ways. We began to figure out, how do we do this kind of work? How do we find the patience again to do this important work? How do we bring people of all walks of life together to prepare the land, to prepare this place for us to get to, again, sorry that this is a blurry picture. So we did. We invited people from all over the country, from all different walks of life, from all different economic and social backgrounds to come and help us to prep this land. And elders came and young people came, and we built a place called Hameka. And this is a storage container, and we put on top of it a roof. And this roof catches 24,000 gallons of water in one rain, basically. We've put up, because we know in the place that we're at that it is such a devastated community, that we needed to have these places that are a place where we can stand strong together, a place where we could have first aid kits and emergency food, and we'll be putting solar panels up on here. these little hubs, resiliency hubs in these neighborhoods that are going to be forgotten if there's a man-made or a natural-made disaster. It's a part of our indigenous epistemologies to take care of our relatives as they, in times of need. And these are some of the places that we're putting together to do that. These places are places for the whole community in times of those kinds of things. We've looked at Katrina and what happened there, and the many thousands of indigenous people and Black communities that were affected by that terrible storm and what happened and how they were left to their own devices. And we wanted to be prepared. And that's what HEMEC is about, is being prepared for those things. And so we have a water catchment system that catches over 1,200 gallons of fresh of rainwater. We have 3,000 gallons of freshwater tanks that are available. And we also put up this structure, the arbor. And this arbor was put up with prayers for the women and prayers for the men, the elders, the youth, and a special pole was put up for our two-spirit non-binary relatives that continue to do this work with us in such an amazing way. We did this over 3 years ago in May, and we're planning on opening this up to the community in order to have it opened in a good way. And what happened was COVID hit, and we weren't able to do that. We also talk about language revitalization. When I spoke to you in my language, it was really about reawakening that language. That this language has been spoken in our territories for thousands of years. The prayers that were said in this land and their waterways were spoken in Chochenyo. The land and the waters are alive, and we believe that they miss this language. And so we are working on bringing the language back to both tribal members and people that live in our territories. We grow our own medicines, our traditional plants that we have used that we've been away from, also plants that are healing that many people are using now. Nettles I use every single day for this, for my allergies, and we use chamomile and many different kinds of things that help us to help our bodies. Our people have always had, no matter where you are in the world, your ancestors had traditional medicines that they used in order to feel better. We're working with elders and youth because we know that elders telling their stories to young people, passing on that oral tradition, learning how to use the plants again to reawaken our imaginations of doing that. Preparing this place as a way to bring people in, to re-engage people in the land again in a different kind of way, a way for us to share stories and laughter and community for people from all walks of life. So I just wanted to stop there and to let you know that bringing land back, doing those kinds of things in our urban areas are important for our children and our grandchildren, but they're important for everybody's children and grandchildren. No matter where you live in this country, you live on native land. It is our responsibilities to make relationships with those native people to create a better world for all of us that live here. Ensure that we have fresh water and good soil to grow medicines and food. It's our responsibility, if we're on this land, to make those relationships and to do better for the next 7 generations. Thank you.
Well, this is this hard part of not being in person. You know, we can't see the applause and appreciation and gratitude for you sharing today, Corinna and Kim. So first, before we open it up for questions, I just want to, again, just really thank you and appreciate that so many golden nuggets that you shared in your presentation and reminders in terms of really understanding how these policies of our country have truly had such a negative impact on the health and wellness of Indigenous peoples. And really, you know, you highlighting the importance of engaging with the land communal healing, a case for why it's important that we work communally together, the importance of oral traditions, and the importance of those traditional medicines, among many other things that you highlighted that have really been impacted by the policies, as you name it and call it out, the continuation of genocide in this country. So I really appreciate you kind of sharing that history for many of us who may not have heard it framed in that way, as we've all been educated in this country and have had a particular type of education that many say is miseducation. So appreciate you kind of planting the soil to help us understand the importance of learning about what has happened just even here in California. But I'm going to stop and I'm going to open it up for questions from our participants. And again, you can put your questions in the chat. Deirdre can help us moderate the chat box. And I'm looking at it now.
So the question should go in the Q&A chat.
Thank you, Deirdre. And I saw a few hands raised, but I want to make sure that people are understanding the importance of putting your questions in the Q&A box. I know go ahead.
While we're waiting, sorry, Dr. Cummings, I also want to just extend my appreciation also to Ms. DeOcampo and Ms. Gould for providing a very important context for our students and our participants. I really think that the only way to come up with solutions or strategies to address inequities is for us to first come to terms with the history of how these inequities came about. And until we do that, you can't adequately, come up with a solution if you don't know what caused it. And so because much of this is not written and ignored, we really feel that it's important to always have the Native perspective to give us a full and I think more well-rounded perspective of what has happened on this land and what continues to happen. And I'll get to the question that is there, but I think what was most impactful for me was, Ms. Gould, when you talked about racial genocide through the blood quantum strategy. And I had never considered it in that way. As an African American, we've all heard of the one drop rule, but this is kind of the reverse, right? So it is a strategy. And I think to think of it as a strategy to control kind of our racial identity in order to politicize race for an agenda, I think is important to know what that strategy is. So I do appreciate you having brought that to my awareness and to the awareness of our group. So we have a couple of questions here that I'd like to go ahead and share. And this is from one of our guests. How can people who are in the Bay Area get involved with the trust, volunteering or other ways to support?
Thank you for that question. One of the ways that we are just now getting back to having volunteers on the land because of COVID. We've been very careful about bringing people onto the land. We have a dedicated email that I will put in for everyone, but it's volunteers@rematriatetheland.org. And you can sign up to do that on the web on our email. We also have an interesting way when we talk about reparations, a way for people to give back. And for us to do this work, we ask people that live, work, or play in our territory to pay shuming. And shuming in our language means a gift. It's a way for us to do the work of rematriation, of taking care of the lands that we have been gifted or are taken care of. We have community gardens that we are growing food. We are doing food distribution to elders. During COVID, we were doing food distribution to people that were immunosuppressed. And so being able to do that, we're always looking for folks that can give of their skills. And there's usually a list of things that we are looking for. So thank you for that question. And I'll put some information in the chat.
Thank you. The next question comes from Lisa Barricker. And she asks, one of the biggest concerns that I have as a public health physician is working with Indigenous communities in Oklahoma. During her residency in Montana, she found it very difficult to make inroads with Native American patients because of their experience prior to being their caregiver. What are your thoughts on how to adequately care for the Indigenous people in her Oklahoma practice?
Well, I worked at the Native American Health Center in Oakland, which is an urban Indian health clinic. Of course, we didn't have any Native American doctors and mid-level clinicians. They were all white. And I think for me, and I don't know what the race is of this person, but yes, absolutely. There's a great deal of mistrust of non-natives caring for us. And so I guess for me, the suggestion would be that when it's time for you to clock out, then perhaps you shouldn't clock out. What you need to do is get involved with that community and get to know that community so that you can build that trust. And that was some of the things that we and Corinna know from working at Native American Health Center, that many of the clinical providers, and I'm thinking of, our PA friend was involved with our Native community outside of her job. So I would suggest that this doctor get to know this community by participating in some of their cultural events, getting to know them and asking them, other things other than just, what's your blood sugar today? Or, oh, your blood pressure's high. You ask about their families, ask about, about their grandchildren or, you have to get to know people if you want them to trust you. So that's what I would suggest that she do. And maybe she's already doing that, but I'm just talking from, my own experience of working in a Native clinic, and none of our clinicians were Native. I hope that helps.
Thank you. The next question is, of course, everyone is thanking you for the presentation and the work that you're currently doing. And so for Teresa Hoskins, it made her think of how in Ireland they have signs in both English and Irish, even if the vast majority of people don't know Irish. And in order to try and recapture the language that the English tried to erase, is this the sort of gesture you would like to see in the US, signs written both in English and the language of the native people of the area? Or is there a different way you would want the language to be brought back to the land?
Thank you. That's a great question. I have seen, watched over my lifetime, many different communities beginning to bring back native languages on signage, and that's beautiful to see. I've also, if anybody's gone to Hawaii, which I have not, but I know that there's a lot of language signs for streets that are there. I think one of the things that we've been able to do just in the Bay Area is to actually just acknowledge that they're on a lot of territory. And we started a campaign so that the city of Berkeley was the first one that changed their whole signage coming into the city that says, "Welcome to Berkeley, a learning territory." Albany City just did the same thing. And so even to consciously begin to do that, right? And then, yes, how do we do the language? And I think that there needs to be more funding put into communities that want to bring back language revitalization, because it's important for us not to, many tribes have to take weekend crash courses with linguists or do research. And so you actually need somebody that's for many people or a few people in your tribe. That's when they're really trying to bring back language in that kind of way, that's their full-time job, and that we can support them in doing that kind of work. And then we can begin to bring that into, my daughter's taking it into second, third, and fourth grade classes where she's teaching them language in numbers, learning songs in that kind of way. And then we're hoping that eventually we can do immersion courses. And that would be the best way to do it. And then after that, then of course science makes sense, right? But you need to hear those words and see those words constantly. And so thank you. So we are doing it with plants, though, in many of the lands that we're doing.
And I just would like to add that after a long battle, Squaw Valley changed their name. We had been pushing to remove this derogatory word towards women, and so that has been accomplished.
That's excellent news. Thank you. The next question is related to land reparations for tribes that are not federally recognized. How would you encourage those tribes to reobtain their rightful land without government recognition? And is there any movement to assist those Native people?
One of the reasons that we started the land trust was in order to put Indigenous land back into Indigenous hands. And so we are not federally recognized, but we are working to get land. And so that's one of the ways you can do it, is to create a land trust. And so many land trusts across the country. And the reason why Sigorte Land Trust was set up as an urban Indigenous women-led land trust is that we found through educating ourselves that land trusts were run by men. All across the board, basically. And that there were very few women that were in charge of land trusts. And then when we started to correlate what has happened with men having control over land, not just land trust, land in general, right? How it correlates to women's bodies, not just Indigenous women, but all women's bodies. How you take out the sacred from the land, take the sacred away from women. How you rape and destroy, and the same thing has happened to women's bodies. It continuously happens to our earth being destroyed and women. And it can we look at it today, how those same things are happening with policies from our government, taking away women's right to abortions and our own right to making self-determination. It's the same thing that happened. So we decided as Indigenous women that it needed to be Indigenous-led. It needed to be an Indigenous women-led, because we as women, as Indigenous women, hold the stories and are the first teachers of our children. It doesn't mean that we get rid of the men. I have sons, I have grandsons, I have nephews, we have brothers, and want to bring people back. But through this process of colonization, through this process, we have lost our sacred duties as both men and women. And we need to get brought back into that. And so it really does need to be about those kinds of philosophies of how do we bring those kinds of things back. And so the Land Trust has been doing that. It's through a process of creating cultural easements or land easements. Today, we had a historic win with the city of Oakland returning land to us, the very first city in the country to do that to the Land Trust and a more federally recognized tribe. We have people that are doing long-term leases with us, purchasing land for us and putting it in trust. And so there are many ways for us to re-engage and just building community and relationships with people that have land and want to give us access to it. And so I believe in what we're doing and the way that we are hoping to re-engage people, even in creating relationships with people that are trying to restore creeks. And how is that our responsibility? And how do we to work with those people that are doing that great work as well?
Thank you both so much for just the insight and for answering some of our questions. We do have more questions, but we're going to have to move on so that we can hear from Dr. Kerby. And if we can get back to the rest of the questions, we will do so at the end of the session. Thank you again. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Kirby Lynch. Dr. Lynch is a critical Black Studies scholar of human geography, political economy, and intellectual history. Kerby holds a BA in African American Studies with a concentration in gender and sexuality, and most recently completed her PhD in geography, both from the University of California at Berkeley. Kerby's dissertation was titled In the Afterlife, Black Queer Spatialities Under Regimes of Displacement, 1963 to 1989, which surveyed the spatial practice of redlining in San Francisco during the 1950s until the 1980s. The focal point of Kerby's research aims to understand how political and economic determinants of the urban inform Black queer subjectivity in the city. Kerby currently serves as a program manager for CERES Policy Research and conducts community-based research on community reinvestment, Afrocentric or Afri-centric public health models, and gender-based state violence. We'd like to welcome Dr. Kirby Lynch, and we look forward to hearing your thoughtful presentation today.
Wow, just so thrilled, excited, grateful, and really blessed. And I just want to say thank you all for the opportunity to speak on this subject. Definitely honored to be on this panel with Ms. Corinna Gould. I learned a lot of what I know about Indigenous sovereignty, especially as my time as a Berkeley student and being protected by the ancestors and their energy on the Hooch and Ohlone land. That really acknowledging that I went to UC Berkeley and received my education from there on the sacred shell mound, on people's sacred territory. But again, I felt so protected and through that whole process by the ancestors. And so I just want to acknowledge that I'm really excited to be here. And even though I'm, a newly minted doctor from Berkeley, I'm born and raised from Vallejo, California, right? From North Vallejo. And it's still so good to be back home because it took a lot to survive the colonial indoctrination of, a lot of the U.S. Academy that is forced upon us, right? So really, really excited to share my truth and also give us some strategic framing for what opportunity we have right now with current legislation related to reparations on the state level and federally. Because this is the time, right? It's not the time to be divisive. It's actually really the time to come together and learn from our shared history on being on this land because it's been a little chaotic, right? So I appreciate every time I get to be in solidarity with my Red sisters and Black Power, everybody. So here is my presentation I'm gonna share with you all. So again, the title of my talk is Reparations as a Public Health Crisis. I really appreciate Dr. Cummings inviting me to the space, and also Ms. Kim DeOcampo, who is just a longtime activist OG in Vallejo, who I respect and honor so much. So I just appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share really my work as a Black scholar to complicate and nuance the reparations conversation as I've experienced it at the national level and the state level, because we need to get a little complicated to make sure that we are really getting our justice. But before I get into the presentation, I do want to provide a labor acknowledgement. I want us all to really get into the practice of doing ancestor acknowledgements, right? Really bringing in who is with us today. But again, also doing land acknowledgement and then labor acknowledgement. We are actually becoming a new people. We're actually engaging each other in a new, different way in these democratic spaces. So, here tonight, we've demonstrated in many ways that we can exist in these spaces as ourselves. And, it's really time for us to decolonize these spaces. So I really want to offer this labor acknowledgement to you all. And it says, we honor the legacy of the African diaspora and the Black lives, knowledge, skills, and labor stolen due to violence and the evolution of white supremacy culture. We acknowledge that much of this country's essential structures would not exist if it wasn't for the free enslaved labor of Black people, and that many people of African descent are still being met with violence and killed today for simply existing. All right. So this is my acknowledgement to my ancestors that this work is real and I take it seriously. I want to acknowledge that labor. I want to acknowledge another ancestor of mine, Miss Zora Neale Hurston, a powerful Black woman academic who was coming up during the Harlem Renaissance, right? During the time of the New Negro. And she really was pushing back against the mainstreaming of Black politics, right? Because we really weren't speaking our truth just in order for us to be accepted by the government structure, right? This is during a time of Jim Crow, right? And what she did as a scholar, and what I want to encourage all the students here, is to really be truthful about what we're experiencing when we're in the field, because our truth actually is a form of analysis. It's what we consider root cause analysis, right? We have to get to the root. Because Ms. Zora Neale Hurston warns us that if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And I love this quote so powerfully because as a historical geographer, I've had the privilege and the ability to travel to international archives and really study our people. I've been able to explore archives in South Africa. I've been able to explore archives in Lagos, Nigeria, to really understand, whoa, this situation is getting kind of like intense. And so as a scholar, it is your duty to really unearth the narratives that have been silenced for so long and re-engage them and redo the analysis that we were denied for pretty much since we've been here, since, we've been under attack and colonization since 1492, right? And so I want to empower everyone as a scholar to really allow yourself to make the inquiry that you need to make so we can really get some justice. I did want to share the statistic Ms. Corinna was referring to earlier. The New York Times did come out with a statistic today, or was able to visualize statistics from the National Center for Health Statistics. And again, as public health students, really this is the time to be alive, and it's important that you use the tools at our disposal to visualize the impact and the weight of this, right? Here you're actually going to see that from the stats, the mortality index from 2019 to 2021, Native American life expectancy, yes, again, fell from 71.8 years to 65.2. COVID was largely to blame. And so, yes, this was a huge news moment today. And I just want us to really contend with that we don't really have much time, that really a lot of these conversations aren't a luxury. I know that we've been having a lot of public race conversations, especially in the rise and the wake of, the Black Lives Matter movement and the death of Michael Brown Jr. specifically. We've had a lot of racial discourse, but it's really time to really contend with the realities of COVID and the real impacts, right? And that's what I also want us to move with spiritually as we're engaging in this policy conversation. Because just right up above, we have Black. I mean, we're not that far off. And I do want us to also be critical about the politics of data and the politics of statistics. As a data scientist, we always have to question, what is the sample size, right? So even though there is a gap, like that doesn't mean that Black life expectancy dropping is less relevant. We can still make discourse about this number and this finding. It doesn't mean that we have to have competing narratives, right? So I acknowledge what I have found from this statistic, which is that our Native American comrades have went from, again, 71.8 to 65.2 years to live on this planet Earth, right? But just here we also see in 2019, we had our Black folks on an average living around 74, right? And ending up just above probably 71, right? So I think we're kind of moving to where our comrades were just 2 years ago. And that's why I make the comparative analysis between the history of Native folks in this country and also the history of Black democratic struggle to be included into the governmental society. because they're not a separate conversation. They actually on a timeline move together. And so this is why this moment is really important. Because again, I'm also contending with the heavy loss during the COVID season, right? During COVID, I lost so many Black elders. I was able to see the actual loss of our culture real time, seeing properties sold, right? They said it was a housing market boom in Solano County. I wonder why, right? So many Black homeowners who were elders passing through COVID, right? I'm thinking about my grandmother who we lost in November 2020, Miss Dorothy Mae Williams, right? Who's from Richmond, California, who was impacted by the 2012 Chevron refinery explosion, right? Who we can actually associate and monitor her quality of life after that explosion and match that and track that timeline to her death date. That's the power of us as researchers, but that's the pain, that's the actual pain of being a researcher of color and looking at reparations as a public health crisis, that it's actually material, that our actual loved ones are suffering right now. It's not really a historical conundrum. It's, things that are happening right now. And so I do want us to think about that as we're talking about reparations as a public health crisis. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's something that we have to move on urgently so we can actually maximize the policy moment that we are in. All right. So what is reparations? All right. So again, a lot of folks are coming into this discourse because it's like coming up again, right? And why is it coming up again? And it's not really making sense to folks, right? On one end, we have the idea of reparations being our 40 acres and a mule, which is a real thing that Black folks know, like that we are owed, right? And that is actually something that was owed to the freedmen who fought in the Civil War, right? Who were the cadavers for the Civil War and fighting on the front lines in the Civil War. That was their promise to do that for this nation, right? And so that is not a myth. It's actually a real thing that we are still owed and due. But it's been complicated, right? Because of history, because of the policy concessions, right, that had happened over time, right? Thinking about the civil rights movement of 1964 and that act, what really has materially shifted from that time when we're thinking about outcomes, that when we're thinking about economic and material and political outcomes, how has our power grown? How has our economic resource and our base grown? And how have we been able to maximize this so-called progress from civil rights movement? And it's really hard to make analysis as a scholar of the progress, because as a scholar, the data shows us that there are so many equity gaps, right? And this is why this language is really important right now as public health students coming up, that this moment of equity that we have is actually your tool to start poking into some of these historical inequities. And so really, what is reparations? I mean, simply, it's an opportunity to ask materially for what we need to restore ourselves back to who we were before we were under these conditions of enslavement and exploitation, right? Specifically, reparations are forms of compensation provided to an individual or group of people for a historical wrong done by the government, right? This is the actual definition that we are using when we are having these policy conversations, right? And this is really not a new conversation. It's been going on in the governmental atmosphere really since the 1950s. Our people really have been talking about reparations at the international scale for quite a while. It started with the We Charge Genocide movement, right? We Charge Genocide is what I want y'all to really think materially about. The willful and intentional ways our healthcare system denies Black folks specifically services and access to life-saving opportunities. And this is done in a myriad of ways. I mean, we can break it down through the housing industry. I mean, it's really going to take us as scholars to really understand what are the institutions and structures that are collaborating together to willfully and intentionally deny Black communities access to, a high quality of life. And so that really was where our ancestors were coming from in the 1950s, right? This is the time of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and we're having those legislative gains. But there are a group of organizers, right, who are thinking about, is that really enough? And so we're having multiple strategies, right? We have the domestic strategy of the civil rights movement, right, calling for desegregation. But we also, again, have our folks moving at that international level in the United Nations, letting the international courts, we actually charge genocide to the United States of America, because look at our history. Look at our state of being in this country, especially post-Reconstruction. Reconstruction was actually a set of policies that the US government promised to Black community members, particularly service members who fought in the Civil War, who were fighting in World War I, that they were going to make strategic investments in their community to build them up, to lift them up out of bootstraps, right? To transition them from the lack of compensation that was being received during slavery to more models of job opportunities that were going to sustain Black life in America, right? So this is how we're fighting for labor jobs. This is how we're fighting for real inclusion into society. But again, at that international level, we still have our folks being like, okay, that may be good domestically, but internationally, someone needs to know the history of African Americans in this country. And so December 17th, 1951, a petition is delivered to the United Nations. And it's, again, this document called We Charge Genocide, the crime of government against the Negro people. And it, again, is a petition to the United Nations. And it's the top scholars, the top Black scholars at the time, writing the argument. Here you see famous author Paul Robeson passing that book, right, to the UN head official at that time, right? So we have folks really, really conspiring at that level, mostly because we have allies such as Ralph Bunche, right, who is a Black UN official, right, the highest Black man head of state that we got, really conspiring at that international level that we can get our grievances met. And so when we're thinking about, okay, that's 1951, oh my God, like, I do want us to know that We Charge Genocide really set the foundation for how the United Nations even views reparations. And so I want to introduce you to these 5 forms of reparations that you as public health scholars and advocates can really start framing solutions for the Black community and even different services that are needed in our community through these frameworks, right? So the United Nations outlines 5 forms of reparations for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, right? Really, we have to recognize that we are victims of gross violations. Not to say that we are victims so that mentally we have a lower state and not a good reflection of how we feel about ourselves, but we need to really understand that we are victims of gross violations so we can stand tall and get our political agenda together of what it is we specifically need to get out of this situation. Because we have been victimized by the system, by the structure. But again, I don't even want to say victimized because it even be politics for that. But again, only saying victim for the purposes of trying to get our reparations in those international courts and be in an international conversation. And so in that international conversation, the first form, right, is a common one that we hear a lot. And this was called restitution. Restitution, which should restore the victim to the original position or situation before the harm and violation of human rights occurred. It includes the restoration of liberty, enjoyment of human rights, identity, family life, and citizenship, and return of property, right? So this is really, really an important form of reparations that we should consider, right? I'm thinking of organizations like what we're hearing with Ms. Corinna Gould and TNF out here in Solano County. Like, these are things that actually move us further towards enjoying our full life, our full quality of life. So really understanding restitution as a critical one. Compensation, it's a controversial one, but it's still a form of reparations, which is an economic compensation proportional to the gravity of the violation that is meant to account for the mental, physical, or other material long-term harms like lost opportunities or wages, right? And that's where I would really love to collaborate with my public health economists out there. You know, we can really come up with some really cool economic formulas particularly economic loss assessments, right? So we can actually really understand how much have we lost playing this game. I think we've been playing the game, and we really need to get down to the dollar amount of what we are owed, because we have lost a lot of opportunities and wages holding out. Third form is rehabilitation, which should include medical and psychological care, as well as legal and social services, right? So what are the actual things that we need tangibly to institutionally make ourselves whole again? Like, what access do we need? Because we need to acknowledge what gaps have we had throughout all of these years, right? So we're going to have to make up for lost time in terms of, right, mental health, right? What does it mean for you as a public health scholar to study seriously healing-centered approaches and trauma-informed care? You know, it isn't a luxury. Like, these aren't like intellectual concepts that we have the luxury of not developing out further and programmatically, you know, because again, this is moving us towards reparations if we're looking at rehabilitation and public health. The fourth form is satisfaction, which includes acknowledgement, public discourse, and the apology for the harm, as well as commemorations and tributes to the victims, right? What would it feel like to be deeply satisfied with the recognition that our ancestors contributed to the economic base of this country, the state, the US government, right? Really contending with the complexity of that politic, right? Understanding the politics of settler colonialism, that we do have our indigenous brothers and sisters who are fighting for land back, but where do we fit in this whole conversation about historicizing our real role on this whole land? And I think commemorations and tributes and a real acknowledgement of our complexity as a people also contributes to reparations, right? Satisfaction, really thinking about that. And again, I think most importantly, as public health scholars, I think something y'all should really assert is the guarantee of non-repetition, right? So the fifth form of reparations is a guarantee of non-repetition, which should include reviewing and reforming laws, contributing to allowing gross and serious violations of international human rights law. So as public health folks really in the field, really understanding the real health impacts of a lot of these racist policies, we got to be able to speak out about it and actually detail what the procedures and the policies were that have impacted our communities. So we can actually guarantee, you know what, no policies like this can really ever exist again, right? I'm thinking about forced sterilization of Black women, not just in North Carolina and the South, but even here in the state of California, and even more contemporarily in our California prison system, right? So reparations actually can be used as a tool to guarantee that these policies don't happen again, right? And that is, you know, really why we have to be in this work, because we have to develop it to its next stage, right? So I'm thinking about Miss Queen Mother Audley Moore, who is the woman who was on the ground really organizing after that United Nations moment, right? Actually organizing reparations after the Black Power movement, right? Because we understand that Black Power was a time that we was really on that rise, we was really on that trajectory, right? With the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, providing services to the community, survival programs to the community. But we know that efforts like that, efforts for self-determination, were undermined and sabotaged by the COINTELPRO, which was a government agency that was really hell-bent on targeting Black leaders who were serving communities, right? And so we had folks like Queen Mother Audley Moore who, you know, wanted to take the energy behind reparations, behind Black Power, and think materially about, okay, how do we take Black Power and we ask really the government to reconsider what does reparations look like for us. So she's actually kind of considered one of the godmothers of HR 40, which is the federal legislation that was introduced in the 1980s to really consider a full reparations package for the African-American community in this country. It has never passed Congress, so this is the effort right now to get HR 40 passed, right? This is something that President Joe Biden really promised a lot on his campaign trail, and then hopefully it's something that can be actualized. But this is the context that we have to do right by the reparations movement, because we have had so many ancestors really taking this cause and really elevating it so it is thorough, so it is really specific. I want to also give a shout out to a scholar. His name is Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter Moore, right? Yeah, Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, yes, at UCLA. And he was actually the lead researcher for the Breathe With Me campaign, which was really the grassroots campaign for HR 40 to be passed last year, but it did not pass. And we're now, again, still urging President Joe Biden to, again, create the Reparations Commission so we can study reparations and what those proposals look like. But something I want to introduce to y'all as scholars are the different dimensions that you can begin to think about reparations in, because we got to get specific, right? So I introduced you all to those 5 forms of reparations, and that's the United Nations definition and standards, right? For us, when we go back there and we give them our full case. And also, Marcus Anthony Hunter invented this kind of framework known as radical reparations. And I want you all to take it seriously, because this is how we start to kind of come up with some solutions with these frames, right? When we're thinking about political reparations, it's thinking about the restorative and reparative, historically informed advocacy, transforming government and political representation and participation, right? We have to really understand that Black people's political participation in the system has not been the most inviting or welcoming. And so we need to be actively reducing that hostile environment. Intellectual reparations. We need the purposeful and public recognition of our inventions and our ideas as a people. So many concepts like intellectual property that, again, has made people billions of dollars has not been given to our community. There have literally been inventions stolen from Black creators and inventors, especially during slavery. That, again, we need a formal recognition of our contribution to this country. We're thinking about legal reparations, restorative justice, thinking about all of the innocent political prisoners, people who are wrongfully in prison right now due to racist politics, right? Thinking about economic reparations, which is monetary assistance. And me as a geographer, I'm really, again, attached to spatial reparations, and that's a lot of the work that I'm invested in, thinking about spatially, how can we revive a lot of these spaces to be autonomous for Black folks, that we can actually feel safe in, that we don't feel overly policed in, right? Because our environments have actually kind of induced, again, complex trauma. A lot of scholars talk about this, right? We have Dr. Stephen Nifley, who's an amazing Afrocentric therapist, a leader in racial trauma treatment, talks about our everyday lived environments inducing trauma, right? Public health scholars, our lived environments are really important for us to critique and tangibly make analysis of, so we can in place public health initiatives to combat the negative impacts. And finally, spiritual reparations is really important, right? Because we are very complex people. Our spiritual worlds was very complex, especially during slavery. And so who we were spiritually as a people was literally beaten out of us, right? We know that the institution of Christianity not only enslaved our red brothers and sisters in Mission Dolores, but slavery was legally something that haunted us, was literally the justification for our enslavement, right? Referring to the doctrine of discovery. I want to shout out Reverend Dion Carter, who keeps putting me on to that. But the actual Bible was a tool to further enslave and dehumanize Black folks. So, at a societal level, we got to think about what does reparations mean, and that's going to take deep community work. But tangibly, politically and legally, reparations can be had. And it's going to take scholars like you all for us to point out the specifics. And that is what's going on right now with the California Reparations Task Force. So I'm going to finish up and end my talk mostly just, again, providing you what opportunity you have right now to contribute to reparations as a concept. You have really the opportunity right now through the task force. Right. So in 2020, Assembly Bill 3121 was enacted to establish a reparations task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. In acknowledgement of the significant and long-term harms that have resulted from the institution of slavery, the task force was charged with studying chattel slavery, its lingering negative effects on living African Americans and on society. Right. So right now, until 2023 of June, the task force is in the process of consulting experts, researchers on California history, the impact of slavery and racist policies, and also the potential forms of reparations for African Americans, right? And particularly, they're thinking about forms of reparations that align with the 5 forms outlined by the United Nations. So again, those 5 frameworks could actually potentially be how we start to craft proposals and solutions for reparations at this California state level, right? So think about that opportunity. Think about the work that this commission is doing right now. I do want to show you this image because it is the reality of this conversation, is that our people were punished and tortured willfully and intentionally. It was a genocidal act that was really meant to, again, diminish the life quality and the life course outcomes of our people for generations, right? If you look at this picture, it's from the actual California Reparations Task Force. Just this past June, they released a 500-page report that really detailed the history of slavery in America and would actually go into detail about California. So you can actually get that free report online. If you Google AB 3121 interim report, you will actually be able to read this. And for you public health scholars, please read the section on mental and physical health, right? They're really talking about the health impacts. But I do want us to pay attention to this image, that this, right? The forehead of Wilson Chin, a formerly enslaved person from Louisiana, was branded with the initials of his enslaver. Chin is wearing a punishment collar and posing with other equipment used to punish slaves. This is 1863, not even 200 years ago. It's very actually recent. If we're thinking about people living to 50, I mean, this is like maybe like, for me, like I can actually go 4 generations back to my great-great-grandparents who were living during this time. It's actually very recent that our ancestors and the trauma that they really experienced with these punishment torture regimes, which was the reality of what made this American economy so great, especially right after we stopped producing hemp and transferred to cotton production. That actual economic decision created the conditions of that type of cruelty and punishment towards our people. And people actually benefited, right? You're actually not paying for labor at all. And you're profiting with no labor expenditure. It really must be nice. But I do want to let you know that that system still exists today in the state of California, particularly with our prison system, right? Step 1 in the prison system, as a worker, you are eligible for 28 cents an hour, right? The cruel and unusual punishment against our people is still continuing. And we really do need to think about the health impacts that are going to come even from the California prison system generations from now. Just to finish up, as public health scholars, it's important that you really do use the analytical tools at your disposal. As a geographer, I love ArcGIS. I'm a mapper. And these are tools that you can use, again, to understand social vulnerability in your community and really associate that to historical policies and actions. The most important historical policy that's really going to probably guide a lot of this reparations conversation is redlining, right? Thinking about the Homeowners Loan Corporation and their government-sponsored plan to deprive Black people of a quality of life via access to institution, right? As public health scholars, please check out Arnold Chandler, Striving and Thriving, Closing Racial Mobility Gaps Across Generations. Concepts such as life course outcomes are really going to help you identify, really, especially if you have a client, where on their life journey did things kind of like impact their life outcomes, right? Arnold Chandler, again, is able to put on a timeline critical moments in our life where if we're experiencing intense discrimination, marginalization, it's actually going to lead to outcomes that are very, very predictable. And we see this the strongest with the school to prison pipeline. And so I would love to engage with you all in the Q&A. I'm actually organizing reparations work here in Vallejo right now. I've been hosting reparations town halls at my family business, Liddell's Shoes in downtown Vallejo on Georgia Street. Come visit us. But we have been exploring this, right? What does reparations mean for Vallejo? Because again, Vallejo is very important. We are the first capital of California, right? We had Black men a part of the Bear Flag movement. We have Black men like John Grider, part of the Society of Pioneers, who is known to be one of the founding fathers of the state of Black men. So with the complexities of that, we do need to acknowledge it. We do need to acknowledge that we have the oldest NAACP chapter on the West Coast, right here in Vallejo, starting in 1918. We need to acknowledge the Port Chicago sailors who lost their life in 1944 due to government corruption, honestly, allowing these men to work in unsafe working conditions. And about 200 or so of them exploded up right in Concord, California at the base. And those people were from Vallejo. And so we have a lot of ancestors that we need to give them justice and reparations, and really looking forward to the Q&A so we can get specific on how we do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lynch. I mean, this was a fantastic presentation. And I'm just going to speak for myself, eye-opening. I have a full page of notes of things that I need to read myself. And so I hope our students in the audience and our community members will take this as an opportunity to, download some of this information so that we can all work as a community towards new policies. So new policies and strategies to provide reparations so that we can all heal and be whole. So Dr. Cummings is going to go ahead and fill the Q&A for the next few minutes.
So while we're getting our questions in the chat, Dr. Lynch, of course, just want to acknowledge, man, so many nuggets, between you, Corinna, Gould today, and Kim as well. Just number one, can I just say the labor acknowledgement?
Oh, yeah.
Appreciating that the connection and alignment between the land back and reparations, so important, so powerful, so necessary as we move forward and create the equity that we all deserve in this country. So, and I do think, like you said, it's complicated and it's simple. It doesn't
right.
it doesn't have to be complicated. And you both talked about several different policies that have deeply impacted the health of both communities. And one of the things that our presenter last week shared, author Daniel Dawes, author of The Political and Economic Impacts, he talked about some of these strategies and what we do to divert these strategies. And one of the things was as simple as voting. And I know there's so many things that come up in our media. There's so much misinformation around how we vote. Civic education seems to be sorely lacking in our schools. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how that is incorporated in some of the work that you're doing around reparations?
Yes, well, voting is very important. I vote. I love to vote. And definitely do want to invite, my folks, Ms. Kim and Ms. Corinna, to jump in. But for me, how I think about voting, particularly in Vallejo, because we have a history of Black folks really feeling politically disenfranchised and really not feeling like they have an authentic opportunity to really represent the needs of the community. It always feels like there's this division of the have and the have-nots, that there is a class dynamic that I've observed more upper middle class folks tend to have a domination of our political scene. And, controversially, when you acknowledge that, it leads to more division and siloing. So I think, particularly in Solano County and Vallejo, we have to vote because we need to have a real representative democracy, right? And I think that Vallejo, for example, switching from the at-large election to the district-based election is, again, a right move in a direction that the people making the decisions for our community are actually representative of the folks who are going to feel this on the everyday, who are actually going to have that lived experience to understand, okay, is this policy really for us? or is this from for an external party, an external investor? Because, you know, Vallejo is a hot spot, right? So when we're thinking about reparations as an economic development strategy, often we talk about Mare Island being closed since the 90s. And man, if I hear that story one more time, because I mean, so many people can still economically have a vision for what Vallejo and Solano County can do, but who's really the leadership bringing that vision to life? And I think, again, that goes back to we need to vote those leaders in. I support candidates. I love candidates. I'm a part of Black Women Organizing Political Change, Solano Napa chapter. And so, again, I have to be a part of the change, and I encourage all of you to be a part of it. And when we vote these people in, continue to go to the meetings. Particularly the county supervisors. Our county supervisors have a lot of power, a lot of budget power. So when we are thinking about reparations and accountability and transparency, it has to start at that county level, the respect for our community, so our city leaders can also respect us too. So we got to work in tandem.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lynch. Corinna, Kim, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add, because you both really did talk a lot about the importance of policy and the implications that these policies have had on health of these communities. Okay, well, we have a number of questions in the chat and a number of number of folks appreciating both presentations. So hopefully you all are looking at the chat box. So the first question comes from an anonymous attendee. Do you believe that reparations will benefit incarcerated people? Incarcerated people are second-class citizens. Is it possible that the public may not see them as deserving of reparations, especially since many incarcerated people have been wrongfully convicted? Mm-hmm. Mass incarceration can be argued as a new form of slavery.
Oh, yes. I mean, and that's what makes, again, the reparations movement scary as it's currently discussed and how the policy is currently being imagined, is that at the same time we're talking about AB 3121 and we're celebrating the first interim report of the task force, we also have in that same month ACA 3, which was a constitutional amendment proposal to actually remove involuntary servitude from being legal in the state of California, right? We have legalized slavery here, which is why the fight to have livable wages for prison labor has ultimately failed. And when you go to Sacramento and you hear the conversations and how the legislators really talk about incarcerated people, they don't think that they're human beings. And so it's going to be really hard to be in the same room with people in Sacramento who are talking about incarcerated individuals like that, also pretend that they want to give Black people writ large reparations. Because if we don't really understand that we're the same people and that at any given time, in any given place, I could have been an incarcerated individual, right? I am a survivor of police violence, right? Did survive an encounter where I was going to be caught up in a system for jaywalking, that our people are vulnerable to being kidnapped by the law enforcement system. So it does get that complicated. But for me, yes, incarcerated people do need reparations, especially for the living conditions. We know that there's overcrowding in prisons, that we know that a lot of prisoners are living with Black mold in their actual cells, which are causing horrible health conditions. We know that there are women who have been forcibly sterilized in the California prison system who wanted to have children, right? But we're having that right taken from them because they're a perceived deviant, a perceived prisoner. So people need reparations for that.
Thank you so much for that, and especially sort of also just kind of digging into, folks who are incarcerated are still a part of the community. In the public health program, you may know we have three concentrations, but the two that get a little bit confused is our Community Action for Health, who Deirdre Wilson is the chair of, and we also have another concentration, Health Equity and Criminal Justice, and we are the only public health program in the country with that as a concentration. But we kind of separate it because it does require a different set of lenses on the fact for just what you said is humanizing what is happening to those individuals in those communities so impacted, not just by individuals going to prison, but the police violence that accompany those communities as well. So thank you so much for sort of kind of putting a pin in that for us.
Yeah. And can I add something to that point? I think I really appreciate Touro University being so socially responsible and taking this future direction because, Solano County is so much responsible for the current private prison industry we understand and are trying to fight against, right? With the opening of the Solano County prison in 1984, that was the first of its kind to roll out. So Solano County is where we perfected this system that we're living under now. And Touro being at the center of that work is so important. So I just want to say thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Wilson, do you want to do the next question?
Yes, sure. So what I'm trying to do is condense some of the questions so they won't come from just one person because there are a few that are similar. But we have a question that states compensatory reparations were in the news a few years ago, I guess around 2020, with significant public backlash or controversy. How would you begin to conduct conversations to open the viewpoints of people who do not support reparations to avoid them completely shutting the conversation down? How can we pull people together?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are a few ways policy-wise these conversations are being had, right? So we have a lot of guaranteed income work, if y'all are familiar, that's coming out, universal basic income, right? So at the international scale, and this is what's really interesting, is that there's an international and a domestic conversation about reparations, and we got to be mindful of what they test out internationally, that they don't bring that over here and try to also bamboozle us, right? And so we do have the case in South Africa where we do see guaranteed basic income programs be piloted after post-apartheid, where poor families who were impacted by, again, lost wages, right? Because apartheid was, again, a free labor system, Black township workers for free, supporting the mines. So this was a reparations program to give digital cards to South Africans to go and get money monthly to support, again, the transition from apartheid to, again, this full democratic society. Because we understand we're transitioning from one mode of economic extraction to a new mode of fairly compensating Africans for their labor. So again, Net One, which was the corporation who piloted these guaranteed basic income program in South Africa, was also manipulating on the back end, the technology, right? So when Africans would go, right, South Africans would go and travel to the ATM and try to get the money off the card, the money actually wasn't on the card, right? So there's a scholar, her name is Dr. Erin Torkelson, who talks a lot about compensation, reparations, how when and if it does come, we got to be really careful on how it's implemented and how that cash or how that money is given to communities. Because I do believe that particular communities and particular vulnerable folks who have been generationally exploited labor-wise, who don't have, again, those wealth-building assets like a home, we do need to, again, give some supplemental cash for folks to kind of catch up and have some assets like, the common American, right? That's the American dream. So when I think about compensation, I'm thinking about what's going to be the dollar amount to get folks to a place of economic stability.
Thank you so much. I think this may be our last question. It looks like we're almost rounding up the hour. This has been just a riveting conversation, so important. I'm almost feeling like we'll need part two to basically be able to truly understand a lot of these complex issues that have been brought up today. So I'm going to Ashley Adams, and I'm going to call out my cousin, Dr. Ashley Adams is going to get the last question. Sorry.
Aw, love it. That's the connection.
That's the connection. Now, where did the question go? She's taken away the question. Where did it go? Well, we'll go on to the next person. This is from one of our students.
I actually have the question.
Oh, you found it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you talked about the continued trauma that comes along with doing this work as it impacts you personally through your own lived experiences. What are some of the strategies you use for your own self-care and maintaining your well-being doing this work?
Oh my God, LOL. If there ever was a practice I had. No, oh my God, it's really important. Self-care is so, so important. I mean, Man, I think, to be honest, I have been an irresponsible organizer. I like to let everybody know I'm celebrating 10 years as an organizer. I got my start in Occupy Oakland, which was a very formative movement for me. In 2011, spoken word, that was my community, poetry, being able to speak my truth, right, through rhyme. And so I'm trying to return back to what really got me into this work, because as I grow in movement work, there's so much that has happened, especially being a youth, to come up in the movement for Black lives. There's just been that, again, that compounding of trauma, right? Being a survivor of police violence, being re-traumatized in all of this work, it's continuous. And then even having the research experience, and the research skills to even know the real specifics and the truth of this oppression, it gets a little crazy. But I have found that research is my self-care. It is divination. I really do feel that research for me is divination work. I am an archivist. That's my methodology, right? So I've spent many times in places where these institutions colonially grabbed my people's spiritual archives, right? Like, you go to Richmond Field Station, they have like real Yoruba sacred stuff that if you ever bring it out, they'll shut down the whole electricity, right? These universities and these archives are holding our people's sacred knowledge, and the work of research is to really pull it out. I mean, all of these spaces, archives are all spiritually charged. So how do I take care? It's like, when I go into them archives and I'm doing this research, I'm doing it expediently, urgently, because I know it's going to impact me. But we got to get the knowledge. And that's kind of been my philosophy for the past 10 years. But for the next 10 years of my organizing life, I'm definitely going to prioritize rest, sleeping, because I did complete my PhD in 4 years. It was a hostile white supremacist environment, being at that, again, colonial university. So I just need to rest, recover, and really organize from a place of love, right? And not from a place of fear, not from a place of bitterness. And really doing this for a love for my ancestors and love for the legacy that I want to leave for my children and the next 7 generations, right? So that's what empowers me.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Lynch. We're going to wrap up. I think those are some really important words and reflection that we can all use. The sleep thing is real, to get sleep, to rejuvenate ourselves. And I think you've given us a lot to think about. And Ms. Gould and Ms. DeOcampo, I mean, the combination of the three of you have been a dynamic addition to this series. To this point, I thought we had some dynamic speakers, but you all have really upped the ante now. So thank you so much for contributing to our knowledge, and we'll probably ask you back in the future. So keep an eye out for our emails. Yes. All right, thank you all for a wonderful session, and have a good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all.